How's it going, everybody? My name is Christopher, this is my dad Leighton, and this is the Oosthuizen Show, and today we are talking about lunging and pulling on the leash, otherwise known as leash reactivity, today on the show. But first, we have a few quick words from our sponsors.
Well, actually, I want to apologize first because we upset a lot of people last week because we were not able to do the show last week, and we posted it in the beginning, about 15-20 minutes or so before the show, and man, did my Facebook blow up. I had people messaging me, and I apologize. It shows we are actually, we do have at least 2 or 3 people that are watching the show.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, so I apologize again. It was my fault. I had some things come up, and I just couldn't get set up in time, and we just had to pull the plug. But anyway, we're back, and as you guys know, our sponsor is Partners Dog Training School. We're an all-services school. We have all sorts of different things going on here. We focus mostly on behavioral training and on our daycare program, which is growing in leaps and bounds. This is our biggest month ever in daycare, I think you said, right?
Yep.
And we've got some exciting things on the go. We did mention our bus before. Christopher doesn't want me talking too much about the bus, but we put in our order today for the bus finally. The order's in. We're having a custom bus made for us, built on a school bus concept.
Well, let me talk about that, and you can set up the watch party on your side. So it's really cool. The dog school bus has always been a famed icon of the school. When you purchased that, 10 years ago?
Oh, more than that.
12, 15?
Like 15 years ago.
Yeah, so 15
I found
years
it at
ago.
a scrapyard, and I rolled in here with this bus, and everyone thought I'd lost my mind, but it's the school bus.
Yeah, and it's been a great marketing tool. It's been a great branding tool for us. We had it parked out on the road until eventually they said that we couldn't have an advertisement, quote unquote, with a billboard on the side of a major road, and so we had to move it back, which lost a little bit of the branding that we had set up. So now we have decided to make the commitment. It's a big financial as well as time-consuming commitment of purchasing a brand new custom doggy school bus that will actually be able to go around to the different homes, to different places in the valley in order to pick up dogs, bring them back to the school, save the pet parents some time, and also provide a pretty cool experience for the pups. So we just put the order in today. Hopefully we're able to have it up and running by January, February of 2020, because these things do take a little bit of time.
Yeah.
And we're really excited about it, and we'll have more information as we get launched and so forth on that. So today we're talking about leash reactivity, which is a term that kind of describes dogs that lunge on the leash, dogs that are pulling on the leash, any type of reactive behavior in response to being on the leash. Now, this could be a symptom of other types of behaviors like territorialness or possessiveness, but there are dogs that do specifically react a certain way to things when they're physically on the leash, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is in a little bit. And also, in some ways, dogs that are leash reactive, they can feel that energy of the leash coming up from the parents, which further increases that state of arousal that we've talked about in the past, which then just kind of cascades out of control. So we'll talk about what leash reactivity is in terms of the symptoms and how to know if your dog does have leash reactivity when they're pulling the leash or when they're lunging on the leash, or maybe they're just a little bit excited to go see another dog or see another person. So we'll talk about what are the different types of leash reactivity here in a second. We'll talk about how to address each different type, and then we'll talk about what you should do moving forward in order to not let that kind of escalate out of control.
So let's key up that piece of video that we've got. So we're trying to give you guys pieces of video that we shoot during the week, and it's going to kind of show a couple of things, and then we'll be able to talk about that, and it'll give you guys a visual representation of exactly what we're talking about when we actually discuss that. So in this particular, this is the one with Melissa.
Yeah, so just kind of preemptive of this, we didn't actually get the dog. This is a dog that's uncomfortable around men. He's a dog that's in training with us here. So has that type of, I would say, insecurity around men, which also translates into some reactive behavior, and then being on the leash, that gives them kind of a quote-unquote tug of war between the pet parent on the other side and the dog, which as they keep tugging, they can't get to what they're wanting to get to, so that increases their drive, increases their behavior. It's kind of like you ever see the thing like where people want to get into a fight and then someone always steps in, tries to pull them away. That pulling of that person away actually increases reduces their behavior and increases their reactivity in that case. And so it's a really similar thing that happens in the leash. So
we'll talk some more about those details. I just want to show you this video first, and then we'll kind of go back to.
Well, so this video isn't going to show the actual leash reactivity. It'll just show a little bit of what we were doing to work with that leash reactivity. Right. So we'll tune it up here so you can see Leighton offering the dog some food to try and get the dog a little bit more comfortable, and you can maybe talk about.
Right. So when you see this, when I offer the food, you notice I'm not going all the way to the dog. I'm kind of moving his head around. I want him to come to me. I want him to work for me. The whole point of training is to teach the animal, teach your pet that they are working for you. You are in control of the game, shall we say, right? So in this particular case, I'm actually working with Melissa, as you can see, and we shot this video basically because we were shooting some video, and I thought afterwards, this would be some great stuff to show you guys tonight. We didn't actually stage anything for this. This was a genuine training session with this dog. Now you can see he's worrying a little bit about the camera. I think you were filming, right? This particular one. Yep. That obviously is part of the training. So again, just to remind you guys, when we're talking about a dog that is reactive to certain things, this dog had some strong reactivity when he was on his leash, and this is like a second phase of training him to work for us. So let's talk about the different types of leash pulling. The most commonly known one is, of course, the dog dragging somebody down the street, dragging you down the pavement, dragging you out the front door, etc. It actually is the same thing as when we have a dog that is also dragging the person in the opposite direction, other than the fact that it's just the dog's different motivation that does that. So let's talk about the one that's dragging you down the street, right?
And we'll talk about like maybe out of excitement and
right. So most dogs do that because they're excited, they want to go for a walk, they want to get to point B, and they have no response towards you. Now, we've talked about this in the past. If you've been watching the show, the first thing we always talk about is foundation. So if I see a dog that is dragging somebody down the street or dragging them across the road, then I start looking at what that dog is doing in general. Is there any recognition, any foundation, any kind of manners towards the owner, towards the handler, right? If there isn't, then we're going to go back to teaching that manner. So we're going to start developing like eye contact between the dog and the handler, making sure the dog's paying attention to the handler. And it's funny because as I say that, I'm thinking about a trainer that wrote that I have great respect for. His name is Gary, and if he's watching, he sometimes watches our show. He doesn't always agree with me on stuff, which is not uncommon because you know how they say there's 10 trainers in the room at the same time, you can get 10 different opinions. But one of the things that Gary says is that it's overrated with a dog watching you in the eyes. And when he told me that one day, we actually posted it online one day, kind of made me think. So after 30-something years of training, I'm going back and reanalyzing what I'm talking about. So when I say the dog looking into my eyes and working for me, I'm really not necessarily mean the dog's watching every single thing that I do by watching into my eyes. I mean he's just paying attention to me. He's cognizant of me. So in that particular case, that video, just bring that video back up again. You'll see that we were having difficulty with the dog paying attention to Melissa, the trainer. Right? He's not even there. So she's got to work a little more on foundation. So in this particular case, I'm not even giving him the treat. I'm just luring him. I'm trying to see whether he'll pay attention to the treat. And he didn't. I shook hands with Melissa a couple of times. I came up close. This is a couple of clips. This is actually after about 10 minutes of training. In the initial parts, he was pulling away a lot harder. But it's the same thing. Foundation, getting that dog to pay attention. Now, let's go to the front door type thing where the dog drags you out the front door. There, that dog is almost territorial. It's almost to the point where he's basically saying, I don't really care about you. This is my space, my door, my opening. I'm going to blow on through the door. Yep. You actually get all sorts of kinds of issues that happen at the front door. But probably the best one I can remember is a dog that would guard the front door, wouldn't let anybody out the front door because he had separation anxiety, wouldn't allow people to leave. In the case like we're talking about now, we're talking about a dog that the moment that door opens, the dog just blasts out through the door. Now, my dogs will do that at home as well if given that opportunity. So a lot of times I'll open the door and then I'll make them hold in position, and in a few minutes we'll show you Crush. We actually did some work with him on the field today, so I could show you a couple of things of how to control this drive. But I would work on that drive type thing to control the door. It's not the door that's the issue, it's the fact that the dog has no response or no recognition of what we're trying to do.
So it really just goes down to obedience and training at the end of the day. If you have a good foundation, like you said, everything comes back down to foundation. So if your foundation is solid, then all the other training that you have will be solid. And funny enough, it's the same thing if you do have a dog that's showing reactive type behaviors that are stemming into lunging, into barking, into
right. So if a dog is lunging at another dog or reactive to another dog, that's the same thing. They're pulling on the leash. They have no respect towards you, but basically their goal at that stage is to get to the other dog. Yeah. We monitor that type of thing. In fact, maybe next week. I just didn't get enough time today. I was going to get you to film some of the stuff during our daycare, because we were working with the trainers in daycare today, and working with, I mean, in this particular case, how many dogs were running around? Probably 17, 20 dogs. 20 dogs running around, and we're teaching them how to interact with one another, because that's what daycare should be, is teaching dogs how to behave. So yes, we're talking about leash pulling tonight in this program, but it's the same thing. I want that dog to listen to me based on his respect for us. And so when he's paying attention and listening, then I know that even if I put a leash on him, he's still going to pay attention. A leash is just a tool. If your dog's dragging you, then chances are they're not paying attention to you anyway.
Yeah, and a big thing that you have to be conscious of with the leash is that you're not loading the leash the whole time. So loading the leash is where if the dog's collar is around their neck and there's maybe a strand that goes out that's still the metal and then it connects to the leash, loading the leash involves actually having the leash pulled up so that the collar around the dog's neck is constantly taut. And that what happens is, you don't have a good correction ability. So if you do have to correct your dog for something, the leash is already taut, and so there's no room for it to actually get that little bit of a snap. The second thing that it does is it starts to constantly pull that energy down from you into the dog and into the leash. So as you start loading the leash, getting worried about, oh my gosh, there's someone coming down the road, my dog doesn't like other dogs, or my dog doesn't like other people, or maybe they're going to run over to them and it's this big, Great Dane, and they're going to scare the other dog. The minute that you start worrying about all those things inside of you, that starts getting tensed down to the leash, and then your dog says, oh, what's happening that I'm supposed to be alert of? And then they start tensing up, and that energy just feeds back and forth. Kind of like what's those tools that they use in singing? They bang it and then it makes it a sound. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. What's that thing called? Well, somebody can tell us.
Yeah, someone.
You guys need to interact more with us. I'm seeing we've got a couple of dozen people on with us already. And of course, these numbers that show up on the screen are not correct, because we're looking at another thing that tracks it, and there's at least 24 names here. But I'd love to read them all off and make sure you guys are listening. But anyways, I'm sure somebody's going to come back to us and tell us.
Yeah.
I also got an email from somebody.
Tuning fork. So yeah, so that tuning fork just goes back and forth.
What do you know about music? I've never seen you. Oh, you were
in choir.
You were in choir, and the other day, what did you get? A violin the other day?
Yeah.
Oh my God, I nearly died. That's fortunately my house is soundproof, so I can't hear his side of the house, which has its benefits as well.
Anyways, so
by the way, you must tell your girlfriend not to text you when we're on our show, because it's very distracting seeing her text show up. So Taylor, stop texting Christopher during the show.
We'll try to focus. All right, so uncontrolled enthusiasm. So another great way to kind of combat leash reactivity, whether it's lunging, whether it's pulling, whatever it really is to channel that energy into something different. Now, usually we recommend obedience, but using some type of positive reinforcer in order to take that energy that right now is being targeted at another object or another person, another dog, and bring it back into something that is positive and something that allows you to kind of regain control of the situation. That's why we usually talk about default behaviors. So having a default routine, such as a heels, sit down, stay, right about turn, left about turn, right about circle, then sit again. If you use that as your routine every single time and pattern that both into yourself and to your dog very well, that allows you to use those in situations where the dog's state of arousal starts to increase. It starts going up from the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then the second that you start to see it incring, you can engage that type of routine.
Explain state of arousal. What we mean by that?
Yeah, so we've talked about this a lot on the show. If you've watched it, if you're a constant watcher. But state of arousal is the dog's kind of energy level inside of them. It's not a necessarily sexual thing, but it's something that comes down to how they're feeling in that moment. Yep. So if you look at it, what's like a good analogy?
Like an emotional thing. So if you have an argument with somebody, your emotional state becomes very anxious. You kind of like light up. We call that state of arousal, right? And it's actually really good if you really learn, if you want to study behavioral psychology, to learn what the keys are, what the little triggers are that push the state of arousal. So for example, if I'm in a discussion with somebody and they start kind of getting under my skin and I start feeling my blood pressure rise, actually my blood pressure doesn't rise, but that kind of feeling, then that's what we refer to as a state of arousal starting to climb. And generally when we're training, I use state of arousal, I use the numbers 1 to 10. So if your dog is at a state of arousal of a 9 or a 10, you're almost not going to get anything. Actually, you're not going to get anything done with that dog. You want to bring that all the way down. So remember, we've talked about these steps before, right? So it's the same type of thing. If a dog's arousal is at like a 1 or a 2, you can interact. You can communicate with them. You can get them to to pay attention to what you're saying. You can get that connection, whatever you want to use, whatever word you want to put in there. Everybody has these fancy words, but basically you want to train when the dog's arousal state is kind of between a 1 and a 3, maybe a 4, right? Now, you have to take into account a couple of things when we talk about this kind of drive, right? This kind of excitement, is that a dog pulling on the leash is often a symptom of a far more critical or serious problem, right? That's where the state of arousal comes in, that's where drive comes in, that's where reactivity, if you have a dog that is reactive towards other things. I want to talk about little dogs for a minute. So we often skip over the little guys, right? Little dogs are generally fairly easy to train. I say that, and of course then I start questioning myself. But they respond a little easier, and because they're small, it's not really that significant, especially if they're aggressive or if they have reactivity issues, biting issues, that kind of thing. They jump up, bite you, it's not a big deal. So we had a situation happen to us this last weekend, and the people were really cool about it, but we were training the dog, and when we were doing snake proofing with the dog, and the instructor, in this case Monica, gave the dog a nick, the dog turned around and tried to bite the trainer. So what that dog in effect was doing was transferring the energy, the pressure from that e-collar that it got nicked at. Instead of placing the association on the snake or the sound of the snake, in other words the odor or the sound, that dog turned around and associated or attached to the trainer. Well, that type of arousal, that type of reaction is not what we want to see. And so in a case like that, what we did is we actually went and started training the dog to work on a leash where we used 2 different leashes. So we put 2 long leashes on the dog, one, both attached to the dog. One went to one trainer and I was the other trainer, and we trained the dog that way, and that way the dog could not actually come back. So we can use that pulling on the leash thing as a guide. We have another dog that's really cool, and I've just got to get permission from the owner to show video of this dog. We had a dog come in yesterday that's got some serious, I don't want to let the cat out of the bag just yet, but some serious reactivity kind of issues, but towards itself. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. He does some cool stuff. Yeah, I don't want to say that because you'll have to watch next week. Maybe we'll do that dog next week. I'm fairly sure the owner will give me permission. We've been working with this owner for 20 years, I think, by now, with multiple dogs. She runs a big operation, big rescue. But anyways, this dog is super cool because most of what he was doing, his first reaction was, and even the reaction of the people that analyzed him before, evaluated him before, he'd been to a vet and they'd done neurological examination on him, and it came back negative. And we had this dog come in here, and the trainer called me and said, can you come down and look at this dog? We've got a really cool video system that Christopher's been putting in, so I can actually watch training and listen to the training while they're actually working right now. So I watched the dogs and I'm like, I don't think that dog's doing this. Anyway, I'm not going to tell you more about it right now. We spent about another 10 minutes with the dog, and today, one day later, we're getting great results with this dog, and this dog has been through dozens of sessions already and without results, and one day we're on to him. And it's exactly the same concept as what we're talking about. We just figured out, oh, wait a bit, you're really not doing this, you're doing that. And then once we figured that out, then Kelly was able to get some great results. And she shot some video of him today, and I was super happy with how that turned out. So again, we're still talking about leash work here. We're talking about controlling your dog that he's trying to drive with the leash. But I want to always remind you that the leash is a symptom. It's just a tool. I could care less. You can train a dog with a piece of string for all I care. In fact, there are dogs in Africa that are trained, I'm sorry, not dogs. There are rats in Africa that are trained to find landmines. And I met the guy, Dr. What's his name? I'll think of it here in a sec. He's a world famous behavioral psychologist. He's from Belgium. Anyway, I can't think right now his name is, but super cool dude. And he showed me how they did this, and then he showed me some video of these rats. These rats are about this size, right? Working over in Africa, finding landmines, and these guys are working them with a little string tied around the rat. So every time I think of leash work and how fancy we always want these leashes to be, I think of the rat with his little string. And these rats were freaking awesome. They never ever made a mistake. They were unbelievably. Normally with a detection dog, we're happy if we get like a 9 out of 10 alert rate. And these dogs were hitting these rats were hitting like 95, 98%. They just weren't making mistakes. Anyway, that's a cool story we have to talk about another time.
So let's, while we're on the subject of equipment, let's talk about what equipment should we be using, what should we not be using, because I would say 9 out of 10 times that a person is having a problem with lunging or leash reactivity of some sort, they're almost always using the wrong equipment. They almost always have a harness on the dog. They almost always are using flexi leashes.
Right. So, boy, you want to get me worked up real fast. You want to talk about getting my blood pressure up. So, Flexies have a specific purpose, and the purpose for them is not training obedience. They are great if you're walking a dog, if you're out, you don't want to contain the dog, but they do a couple of things that we don't like. First of all, it encourages your dog to put pressure on the leash. It teaches them to drive, to pull, to tighten up on the leash. The second thing is
by them pulling harder, the leash then extends out further, and so
that's right. That's how the dog gets further out. The problem is that by pulling harder and successfully being able to extend that distance, the dog is rewarded by that, and so therefore they learn to pull harder on the leash. Then you put that dog on a conventional leash, and the dog thinks he's going to pull all the time. The second thing is, depending on which flex you're using, some of them are incredibly dangerous. They are, they're relatively thin nylon cords, and if you get that thing wrapped around your finger, around your hand, I know people that have got some serious injuries from that. So I apologize to Flexi. I'm not trying to hurt their business.
The actual objects of them breaking and then
Right.
flying back and hitting people.
Sure.
At the very end, maybe the collar or whatever breaks off, and then it comes back and hits the person.
And wrapping around, they drop the handle, it runs, the dog takes off across the field, that thing's whipping around, that thing wraps around somebody and cuts into them. So I'm not a big fan. Now, I actually do use Flexies because I use them in a different application, but this is not the time to talk about that. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'm not a big fan of are harnesses. And I must also emphasize here that I'm not a big equipment person. We don't really mind what equipment you use as long as one, you use it correctly, and two, you realize that everything has its time, has its goal, has its place, right? So a harness would be great for training a dog to do tracking, where I want that dog driving. I want his nose down, I want his body down when doing shits on style tracking or air scenting or something like that.
Well, that's why they were, essentially they were made originally for horses pulling a carriage. And
right,
so they put the
you
center
train
of gravity around the dog's strongest point, around their chest, and it's meant for dogs to be able to talk to pull and be able to have that in a comfortable and structured way.
So harnesses are not necessarily the right thing for this. And then of course you go to all sorts of other things. You can use a prong collar. Prong collars have their purpose as well. Some people don't like them because it hurts the dog and they don't like that. The way to look at that is if you have a serious situation where the dog is pulling hard and you have a person that is not as strong, maybe it's a female or is an elderly person or a child or something like that, they just don't have the physical ability to withstand or to hold that dog back, then sometimes a prong collar will help that. I like using e-collars, electronic collars, where the dog learns that he's got to walk at heel or he's going to get a nick from an e-collar. That also works well, but again, you have to learn how to use it. You can't just put it on the dog and nick the dog because he has no idea what you're talking about. All of these techniques require a foundation, and you have to put that foundation into the dog. Let's pull up that video of Crush.
So here's a quick video here. Let's see if I can bring it up to make it easily seen.
Oh, so this is where we were doing the turns, right? So one of the ways you could stop a dog from getting ahead of you is to do an about turn. So you'll find a lot of times we'll walk, and you can see that Melissa's actually using a prong collar and a training collar at the same time. We often will do that because it kind of takes away some of the prong collar, but it also allows us, because prong collars have a nasty habit of releasing. Sometimes they unclip themselves, and obviously even though here we're in a gated area, as you can see, this training area is a gate. It's got a 7.5 foot gate around it, fence around it. But we want to use a little bit of pressure on the dog. Now, here's the tricky part. There is no one way to train a dog. It drives me crazy when people say, oh, you got to use this or you got to use that. There's all sorts of different techniques, all right? Sometimes you want to be positive and purely motivational, and other times you want to use a little bit of compulsion. A lot of times compulsion will get a much faster result, but it doesn't always work. In this particular case, we're kind of balancing that approach. Doesn't mean to say that we're not going to use a correction, but we're kind of like pushing the dog, come on, work, and then eventually they settle down and they do fine. You can go to the system where you use only positive. The problem with doing that, it takes much longer, and then the dog realizes you don't really believe in your own thing because they see it as being soft.
Even at the end here, you'll see Melissa offering the treat, and the dog doesn't really care about it. It's more focused on me filming,
on the camera and so forth.
And
if it wasn't you, it would be something else. So remember, this dog happens to be looking at Christopher, but there's all sorts of different things. Just go back to the video and drop it back about 30 seconds for me. So one of the things that we do all the time in training is we try and keep the dog moving, and you can see Melissa's doing that right now. She's basically walking back and forth. She's walking on the edge of the pavement because that kind of distracts him from the thing that he's nervous of. Right now he thinks the world's going to end because there's a male figure, that would be me, in front of him. Dogs are often worried about male figures because they see it as kind of like a threat to them and so forth. That's why people with hats, people with beards, people with big overcoats, etc. And you'll see eventually, I don't know if we have video, but eventually he did take a treat from me, and I was able to actually walk him a little bit back and forth. But we don't push the dog to the point of falling down. I don't want you to fall off the cliff, right? I want you to walk up to the edge, push, 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 nudge, nudge, encourage, encourage, motivate, motivate, and then sometimes you got to back off a little bit. This is very similar to what I would do if I was trying to expose a dog to something where the dog is showing strong avoidance to something, right? He's maybe apprehensive of a new smell or a new location. Training dogs to become acclimated to different surface conditions. So in this case, we use paving, we use stone, and we don't see it in this shot, but we also have grass areas and dirt areas. We also have a smooth floor. So we have 5 or 6 different surfaces we can put that dog on to get the different training.
Yeah, and there's a couple things also in that video you saw. You saw Melissa using body pressure from her torso as well as from her knee. A lot of times when we're putting up a knee to put pressure on the dog, we're not even making impact, or we're not ever actually contact. But it's mainly there to, exactly like I said, put pressure on the dog in order to get them maybe to focus back on you, to break that line of intensity and channeling between the dog and whoever they're targeting in that moment. So there's a couple things that we were seeing there. Now let's take a look at, this was some training that you were doing today with Crush, and in this video you'll see both you working on the leash with Crush, but really not using the equipment much at all.
Right, so you'll see that I actually wasn't using a leash at all. I didn't even have a leash with me, and I quickly shot this video this afternoon because I wanted to show you guys where you kind of are looking at being. Don't get hung up on this leash thing. You know, we're talking about the types of leashes, and most of the time I use a leather leash, sometimes a nylon leash, sometimes I use a long leash, which is about 25-30 feet long. Just get a lunge line from a horse place or a tack store or something like that. Make great training leashes. I often train with that. But in this particular case, you guys watch and you try and tell me what you think was the reason why Crush was paying attention to me. Let's watch this video for a little bit. So this is Crush. This is my Dutch Shepherd. Very, very high power dog. Wants to work.
And look how Leighton uses his body here, kind of adjusting so that Crush knows. Right back in the very beginning here, we'll rewind it back in a moment. But always with the torso, not bending down as much because that lowers the elevation and gives up some control there.
So there I left him in a stay position. I walked forward, walked around. I want to keep my contact. There's the eye contact I was talking about.
So
now,
watch the torso here. Yep, there.
That's called the flip around. It wasn't a very good one. I probably should have warmed him up a little more to make him more impressive on camera. But you know, this is also one of those things. A lot of times when we film our shooting videos, you know, and we put them on, there's awesome. We edit them so they look really cool. But the truth is that that's not reality. It's kind of like looking at a picture on Instagram of this hot looking female. It's not reality. She's done up. She's put 2 hours of makeup into that, and that's not the real world out there. So the same thing with dogs. If you look at this, you'll see this is basically me with no practice, no warming up, no getting him ready, etc. I basically said to him, heel. I was talking French to him. You can't hear it because we're not running sound, are we?
He's barking too loud. It wouldn't.
I was training him in French at the time, and you can see that I said earlier on, can you see what I used to motivate him? So you notice the cup lying on the ground? That's his motivator. That's the reason why he's working. And so what I had earlier on is I had the cup in my hand, and he was watching the cup while he was learning to heel. But I can leave that cup on the ground. In fact, I think we saw that in the shot. I did leave the cup on the ground and do one heel pattern with it because I wanted you to see that even without the cup, can still get him to listen to me. This is the contact that we talk about. This is him paying attention, and I don't even need a leash. Yep. So when we have dogs that pull on leashes, our goal is to get the dog to pay attention and to get him to work with us. But eventually we want to give up on that leash. We want to focus. And in this particular shot, you can't see it, but the person running the camera was Kelly, and she actually had a dog with her just behind her. And he's completely unfazed by that dog. There's no attention. His concentration level is good. That was a little sloppy. He's supposed to stop. So if you guys are one of the pro handlers and you're watching this, I'm sorry, my dog sucked at that stage. And this was just a stupid plastic cup that I picked up. I'd had drunk some water out of it. I could pick up virtually anything. I can pick up plastic bottles. In fact, in the morning, when I wake up in the morning, I've always got my bottle of water next to my bed, and it's normally 3/4 drunk at that point. And Crush will sit up next to me and watch me because he knows I'm going to finish the rest of that water, and then he gets the bottle, the empty water bottle. So it's not what you use, it's how you use it. It's how you build that focus on the dog and how you get that enthusiasm enthusiasm working for you.
And obviously Crush has a enormous level of energy and drive. So it doesn't matter if your dog is a border collie, if your dog is a lab, and if it has a ton of energy, you can channel that energy into just as good of obedience and probably even better obedience, because they do want to work for you at the end of the day. So as long as you're channeling that and using your foundation, your obedience in the right ways, then you can achieve really, really great results along those lines.
And you know, earlier, I just want to finish up something. I started talking about small dogs earlier on, and then I think I got sidetracked, which is my standard thing in life. So when you're training a small dog and the small dog is not walking nicely at heel, they're pulling on you, dragging forward or whatever, then go back to using their food. Remember, we've talked about this in the past, but just a quick summary. So the food that you normally would feed your dog, instead of it just putting down in front of them in the morning or in the evening or both, basically pick that bowl of food up and get your dog to follow with you. Many years ago, there was a guy called David Dykman. He was one of the first ones that kind of started this system out, where he put a long line on the dog, and all he would do is just walk away from his dog. When the dog ran towards him, he would turn and walk the other way. Dog ran towards him, turn and walk the other way. Wish we could find a piece of that video, because he was really, I mean, it's such an obvious system now, but I use it all the time. And with little dogs, it's really an effective way of training. So we don't actually put pressure on the little dog to train with us. Now, we will do that because with little dogs, you need a little more skill. They're very, very soft. They're very sensitive. If you put too much pressure on them, so remember we talked about balancing, compulsion training or pressure or forced training, if you want to use that term, making your dog sit. There's a technique, basically it's a technique that is in effect compulsion training versus teaching a dog to walk for a treat. Now, whenever I bring up treats, I have to always say, remember that the treat thing is just a tool, right? The food is just a tool. We're going to pull that food out eventually. You notice the way Crush works. Crush was trained using food as his reward in the beginning. Now he works with there's food there, whether there's a toy there, or whether it's just straight reward. So it's not that. That's just a bridge. That's correct. That's just a temporary reward system to get your dog to work for you. Don't underestimate that.
Yeah, one thing I do want to mention is the idea of taking and making sure you're putting your dog in the ideal situations while you're still working on training these types of behaviors. So when you're still getting started, don't put your dog into very potential situations that can increase their state of arousal, such as going to a dog park, such as taking your dog even out on a walk while you're still kind of working on these behaviors, because you need to establish the obedience and control and foundation when there's no distractions around, so that way you can have the best chance of success when there are distractions around and when there is things that might potentially trigger them. So making sure that you're avoiding those types of situations as best as you can while you're still working on it, and then gradually adding them in as your amount of control increases, so that way you can work through those types of situations. So again, like I said, avoiding the dog parks, avoiding objects or potential triggers that like if you're walking down the street and you see another person walking down the street, cross the street, go to the other side, potentially maybe go down a different path as best as you can, so that way you don't set your dog up for failure, because every time that they reinforce the idea of not listening to you and they reinforce the idea of increasing their state of arousal to go up to that trigger, that's just a little bit more of a setback that you have to continue to kind of battle against. So establishing that control centers and those default behaviors in a quiet setting, so that way you can gradually introduce those triggers into your training.
So Sarah made a really good point here, and I missed it because I'm monitoring other stuff and Christopher's on this side. But she said she brought up using a slip leash. So a slip leash is just a simple, tiny little nylon leash. It's got a little ring at the end. You basically feed the leash through itself, through the ring, and it makes a little slip leash. We train probably 50-60% of the dogs we train here at the school using a slip leash, just simply because it's such a simple thing to use, and because we're training the dog on technique, not on what specific collar or what specific leash to use. Now, if you come to class, we don't want you using slip leash. We prefer use a proper training collar and a proper either a training collar. I'm sorry, I said a training collar. A proper leash or a training collar with a martingale. It would also work well.
Whatever your trainer
whatever what you prefer and what the trainers have told you to use at that time. We will often go back and forth, and this is something for you guys that are not training with us or whatever. Keep in mind, there's no one way to can I say skin a cat? There's no one way to get something done. You've got to look at different things and be prepared to try different stuff. The fact is that when you take the school bus we were talking about earlier on, we've been working on the school bus thing for well over a year. And I saw a bus the other day and I just instantly fell in love with this bus, and it was exactly what I wanted. And then when I called them up, they brought me a demo version of it out, and we liked it. We liked everything in it. We found a way that we could convert it, and today they sent us the new designs of what I wanted done. And I mean, it took us a long time, and we went through 4 or 5 different variations of this before we finally settled. So don't ever settle. Work on it over and over and over. Don't give up. But a lot of times people, I mean, when I'm traveling around, which I do all the time, people often come up and say, my dog does this, dog does. I'm like, it's the same thing, guys. It's exactly the same approach. Build your foundation, get your dog to pay attention to you, get your dog to focus. Use food as a reward. Even if your dog doesn't like his food, as a highly motivated reward, you can use a high value food if you want, high value reward, we call
Find
those.
out what motivates them. Maybe it's your verbal, maybe it's
right,
a toy.
Toys, something like that, or maybe it's as simple as like the back door. And I remember with one of my dogs, I was training him in French ring. I could not get this dog to do a stand exercise. We had to stand up. He'd been through a bunch of different trainers, and they struggled to get that done. And I literally spent probably 2 months trying to teach this dog to stand using every technique I knew. And then one day, as I was letting him out the house, he ran up to the sliding door, the glass door, and I was going to open the door, and he was in a sit, and he popped up into the stand position. I'm like, oh, good boy, stand. And then I told him sit, and I told him stand, and he stood up again. I opened the door. And from that day on, that was the way I trained that dog to do a stand. Mm-hmm. I would never have thought about that had it not just kind of fallen into place. But you got to stay alert. You got to be aware.
And the one thing I want to also add to that is making sure that you do have realistic and reasonable expectations. Because again, these are dogs, these are animals. Animal behavior is always changing, even from the day to day with your same dog. And so making sure that you remember Rome wasn't built in a day, having reasonable expectations of your dog, and then obviously putting the work in is a really great formula for success.
Have you been to Rome?
I have been to Rome a couple times.
I haven't been. I can't afford to go.
Yeah, you got to speak to your boss so that way you get some time off to go.
That's true.
There you go. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for watching today. We'll be here next Wednesday at 6 p.m.
And we talk about socializing dogs. And we'll show you some footage of daycare, because we're training a lot of our new people in the daycares right now. And so it's a great opportunity. We'll shoot some video of that. We'll probably have a good 10-15 minutes of video next week. I really like the video. I think it gives you guys a direct connection and a graphic of what we're doing. And let us know how you feel about that. Do you like the videos, and do you want us to use more?
Yep, definitely. All right, guys. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.